the Pod Network Entertainment.
You're listening to Now Steaming, where we dish out hot takes as Chinoy millennials. My name is Stancy, and of course, I'm joined by my co-hosts, my partners. They are the co-creators of So Asian Comics, Kimberly Mas and Cedric Cheng. And Kim said we have such a special episode for today because we're going to be talking about a topic na very close to our hearts. Kim, most especially para sa'yo, because of the three of us, ikaw yung pinaka-fluent in Hokkien.
Oh, yeah. I mean, my mom prepared me for this specific episode, I think. I don't know. Like, it's kind of weird that I only found out that you're not you can only understand but you can't speak.
Yes, exactly. I mean, pag na-force ako in a situation where kailangan ko ng ilabas, yun, lalabas siya. But like at this moment, I can't just... Yeah, wala akong off switch or on switch for the Hokkien na matic, hindi tulad ng English and Tagalog.
Yeah.
Said, I know you're the same way.
Oh, please tell me about it.
That's exactly why you guys are seated there.
No, it's like on Kim's end, like you were trained to be the ideal Chinoy wife.
Well, I don't know.
Gusto ko yung kinikilig si Sed as he's saying it because he knows what he's getting himself into eventually.
No. I mean, as an uncle, auntie slayer. Yeah, with her Hokkien, like when I first introduced her to my dad,
man.
my dad was like, sat up like, whoa, someone can speak.
Panalo na agad. Yeah. You don't let her go.
Exactly.
I don't even know that until you told me about it.
Yeah.
So like I came to his house, but we were just friends that time. So I was like, Uncle Hoami. And I was like, in that accent.
Who does that in the 2020s? Who says that?
My mom was like, okay, if you're meeting your friends' parents for the first time, you have to greet them like, okay, Hoami or Ho Tsaki, whatever.
Wow.
Right?
As
And
my
then I
dad
was like,
stood up from his chair.
yeah, he was watching TV and then
Shit.
I was like,
Okay.
do you want anything to eat or drink?
There's so much to unpack here, and we have to unpack it with our guest, who we haven't introduced yet to our listeners and our viewers. So it's only right na ipakilala muna natin before we get into that very weird story about how you made an impression on Cedric's parents. Okay, let's introduce our guest. He is a professor and a social linguist who practices over at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Please welcome to the show Professor Wilkinson Gonzales. Will, thank you so much for joining us on Now Steaming.
Yeah, it's nice to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Will, you work for the CUHK, no? So does that mean that you're based primarily in Hong Kong?
Yes, I've been working in Hong Kong for about 2 years now, getting into my third year. So yeah.
Pero taga rito ka, like
Yes.
you're Lannang, you're Tsinoy, born and raised dito sa Pinas.
Yes, born and raised. Actually, born in Iloilo, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So tell me about that. Being born in Iloilo, how long did you spend there? Is there a big Chinoy community in Iloilo?
Oh yeah, for sure. So I was born there and I stayed there for about 9 to 10 years, I think, before moving to Manila. And I think there's a kind of a stereotype that people outside Manila can also be a bit conservative. But at the same time, I also hear people saying that, oh, they're Chinese or it's not as good as people in downtown Binondo, right? But in my experience, at least in my social network, I think people in Iloilo, especially the Chinoy community there, they are way more, how would I say it, multilingual, right?
Oh,
They
I
switch
see.
way more often than people or Chinoys in Manila. Yeah.
So before we started recording, sabi mo you went to Hope, diba?
Yeah.
So nag-migrate ka to Manila, that's where you came of age. So what's the
Right.
biggest difference from between yung Iloilo Chinoys and the downtown Manila Chinoys?
Oh, that is a really good question. I mean, I can answer that from perspective of education.
Sure, yeah.
So, when I was schooling in Iloilo, I was studying in Hwaseong, basically, or Central Commercial High School back then. Now it's called Hwaseong College. And the medium of instruction there was actually English and Chinese. I think at that time it was still Hokkien, with a little bit of Mandarin enhancement classes. So, tapos pinagbawalan yung regional language. So you can't speak in Ilonggo, you can't speak in Tagalog actually.
Oh.
Otherwise, you will be penalized.
Ano yung mga punishment?
Oh,
Pinapalo? Pinapaluhod ba?
Hindi, magbabayad ka ng 1 pesos.
Oh, wow.
1 peso.
Yeah, 1 peso lang kada.
Ay, sa pondo ng Pinoy?
Yeah, something.
Actually, I'm funny because you reminded me of something. Kasi in our school, like if we cuss, since all girls school kami, we have to put like 1 peso.
So similar
it's kind of similar to that.
Yeah.
We had
Hindi ka
that
talaga
too.
pineperahan palalo yung mga estudyante.
We had that
Right.
too, but
Piso lang.
English. We had to talk in English.
What?
Like, and then if not, Tagalog, whatever, you have to
You also have to pay.
yeah pay
Oh.
Yan
like
talaga yung mga galing sa mayaman na school, Makati Hope, Ika, pineperahan lalo eh. Buti sa
Mga
Xavier,
Xavier.
minumura ka lang.
Yeah, so there's siguro yung difference kasi when I moved to Manila, I was so surprised because everyone was speaking in Tagalog. It's so Taglish. Sobrang parang wow, it's a whole new world. And then in terms of Hokkien naman, like I think it's similar basically, but I guess my case is a little bit different because although I was born in Iloilo, my parents are both from Manila. So at home we speak the Manila version of Lannang or Hokkien basically. So it's not that big of adjustment, but talking to other people in the Iloilo Tsinoy community, I can understand maybe around 60% of it, but it has a lot of like very rich additions and influences from Ilonggo. Yeah.
I'm just curious. Is there like Ilonggo words in the
in
Iloilo?
like the Hokkien, yeah. So
Oh.
parang switch na ng switch. It's really interesting.
That's super interesting. I only
Yeah.
found out about that today.
Yeah, parang siyang ano eh, it's like a Creole, di ba? It's kind of like how dito sa Manila, yung Hokkien natin has a lot of Tagalog words incorporated into it. So you're saying na even in Iloilo, may
Yes.
ganun din Ilonggo sprinkled into their Hokkien.
Right. Or the other way around as well. So Ilonggo na may Hokkien sa gitna. Parang ganun.
and I mean my mom is also like from outside Manila, and the way she would talk sometimes titolo yung kwan, you know?
Oh.
so she
Diba,
would
no?
yeah
yung
so
kwan.
yung kwan so
Yeah.
I would hear that from my mom.
Oh wow.
So you mentioned growing up and speaking Hokkien at home. How hard or how easy was it for you to just absorb all of that? Kasi I think we mentioned this off air, no? Na I am a Hiao Kong. So like, you know, these things are familiar to me when I hear it, but I can't just like say things on cue. Right? So how easy or how hard was it to pick up the language to the point na conversant ka na?
Right. So I don't know if my experience is the same as other people, but at least for me, when I was born, so I consider my native tongue Lannang talaga. Like so
That's your first language.
First language because
Damn.
my mom and dad would only speak to me in Lannang. And when I say Lannang, I'm not talking about pure Hokkien. I'm talking about yung halo-halo, yung mixed language na Lannang. So and I also have another story about that if you're
No, go right ahead.
interested. So I've in terms of like acquiring Hokkien, it's a little bit interesting because my elders, my parents, even my parents actually would always correct me. You know, say, "Oh, di mang tamang ang kong ani," but then they will use it. They will use, for example, di mang halo. But they're literally
See,
using.
can we translate that for our
Oh,
listeners
sure.
who might not understand everything?
So di mang means like do not or don't mix, right? But then they actually use the word for in
Mix.
Tagalog halo
Halo, yeah.
in the Hokkien phrase
So
to
ironic.
berate me. So
Yeah.
it's a super interesting phenomenon. Actually, the whole reason why I got into linguistics in the first place. Why do people have so bad perceptions of Hokkien, and why are we using it in a very creative way? But somehow the community's like split about it, diba?
Yeah.
So, when you say na first language mo yung Lannang Oe, does that mean that you also think in Lannang Oe?
Oh man.
That is a really
yeah,
good.
that's-
Do you do your maths mentally in Lannang way?
diba? Diba?
Okay.
Paano yung pagbilang mo? Tit ng sasi or 1, 2, 3, 4?
Okay,
Tsaka 1, 2, 3, 4
I
bilang
just
ko
have
eh.
to
Doing
put
the
this out.
multiplication table.
I really have to put this out because I memorized the multiplication table in Hokkien.
Oh my
Fucking
god!
nerd.
Same.
No, I would
And
die.
I'm not surprised because my mom is from Hope.
Okay.
Like Hope, tas
Oh.
nag-uno siya. So like the upbringing, I can feel like it's
Na-inculcate
the same.
talaga.
Pero nasa Ika lang ako. So you can see like the tension
the
talaga. They're like,
difference.
oh my God, but ano, nasa Ika ka, you're gonna be not so good or not so fluent anymore in Chinese. You're going to be, I don't know.
Dishonor on you. Dishonor on your cow.
Western when you're there. And I'm like, what's wrong with that?
So going
Yes,
back,
yeah,
Will,
going back.
yun nga, do you think in Lannang Oe?
Yeah. So yes and no. So in terms of math, yes, for basic numbers,
Right.
I always like do the multiplication table like DITD, DDC,
DDC.
salak. So memorize yan.
I'm getting flashbacks.
Things you guys don't know.
Right. So yeah. So I usually think in Lannang, but I always catch myself thinking in Tagalog and English as well. So I guess it's very multilingual. Yeah.
So in terms of growing up, paano yun? Were you also exposed to media na Hokkien or anything? Kasi from my experience, I attribute yung fluency ko in Tagalog to the amount of Tagalog dubs I watched growing up. Yung mga Tagalog anime or yung mga teleserye. Like those are the reasons why for me, I speak in Tagalog better than I would in Chinese, for example, because I didn't really consume Chinese media until the F4 phenomenon in the early 2000s.
Oh man.
That's a really good question. Because, like, I don't think there were other, like, Hokkien or Lannang like,
Materials.
media
Yeah.
materials in the Philippines, or at least back in the day, like in the 1990s, right?
Yeah.
Parang wala pa masyado.
Oh, so it was mostly like, okay, I'm just curious.
Home.
It was mostly like at home, right?
At home. It
And
was a home
then
language.
Maybe
yes.
like when you went to your grandparents, your friends, do you speak in
Yes.
Hokkien also?
Yeah. There's also a really interesting kind of like thing that I found and observed is that I think a lot of the more Hokkien or more conservative, like Tsinoys or Chinese, if you like to call it, they tend to also be religious, right? So I think the language is actually really well preserved in some religious groups, like Christians, for example. They have services still in Hokkien.
Oh.
Yeah,
So
the
that-
Amoy service.
Right,
Yeah.
the Amoy services,
Yes.
I think. So we can't really ignore that fact that I think religion plays a role also in
Oh.
Hokkien preservation.
Have you attended a service in Hokkien? Or
Oh
have-
yeah, for sure. Yeah, a couple actually.
Same.
But there's a Hokkien, just a pure Hokkien version. They call it Amoy or
Yes.
Minan, as I like to call it. And then there's also a bilingual service where
Yes.
they have it in English and Amoy or Minan or Hokkien, alternating.
I think the church that I visited once, like they had a translator.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
one would
yeah.
preach in Hokkien, and then there's after that someone would
right.
translate
Translate
it.
to
So the
English.
service would take double the amount of time.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
If it's an hour, it's gonna be like 2 hours because of the translation.
Like,
But there's also like a pure. I know I've been to a
Yes,
service
meron,
that they
yeah.
don't have any translation at all. And when
okay.
I was there, I was like, "What is
And you
go-
can
I
see
don't
the
understand."
audience.
Yeah,
and you
I
see
don't
the audience.
Naglalag na rin yung mga utak nila.
It's basically context clues. Kind of
Okay.
like how I learned Hokkien. It was like context clues.
Yeah.
So, let's talk about Hokkien in the Philippines specifically. Kasi you already alluded to it na yung paggamit natin ng Hokkien or Lannang as we call it is really a melting pot of phrases, context clues, borrowed words, diba? Some of which bleed into one another. So maybe you can you please describe muna why that is?
Well, like why people mix?
Yeah, bakit siya nagmi-mix or paano siya naging significant, I guess, to
Right.
our community as Tsinoys?
Right. So one thing about Lannang is that it's actually very social. We would like in sociolinguistics we like to call it as a kind of a social entity or social construct because Lannang it depends on how people say it because they probably say my Lannang means pure Hokkien. Some people say Lannang is may kunting halo, right? Some people say that Lannang is really, really mixed. So
Yeah.
I guess the position I'm taking and so far in my research is that Lannang is kind of a continuum, right? Where you have the very pure conservative church-like Hokkien. And then at the end, you have the very mixed, very vernacular, very casual, very innovative.
So it's like a
Hokkien.
spectrum.
I would like to think, personally, my research tends to go in that direction right now. And that's also what we observed for like in my research when I did it, when I did the kind of like survey and field work on 130 to 40 Lannangs in Metro Manila across ages. Yeah. So Lannang is very social. And I think identity plays a very big role into the mixtures or influences from Tagalog, English, and other languages. We can't also ignore the fact that Mandarin is starting to also seep in a little bit, but it's definitely not as much as Tagalog and English when it comes to like influences. So identity is definitely one part. First language, right? Or exposure to different languages. Like, so for me, I was really exposed to an English school when I was really, really young. And wala masyadong Tagalog input. I got most of my Tagalog actually in high school.
Okay.
So it's a little bit different in my case. So, but I know people who speak more Tagalog, like their first language is Tagalog and Lannang or Hokkien is just second or third, right? So we would expect maybe a little bit more mixture. Not just words, even the accent is also a little bit different.
Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned your identity, which I think is very nice to get into kasi when we started the podcast, it was really an exploration of identity and how you identify as Tsinoy and how there are people from within our community who would rather not identify as Tsinoy. So maybe can we get into how that relates into your mastery of Hokkien? Kasi diba, it does kind of go hand in hand.
I would say so, right? So identity, we're talking about different identities here. We could talk about Tsinoy identity. We could talk about Lannang identity.
Is there
Chinese.
a difference?
I mean, some people tend to make a difference. And this was actually observed when I conducted surveys, right? I gave them like 6 options, and some of them don't are given like they're given all the options: Lannang, Phil Chai, Tsinoy, Chinese, overseas Chinese, and not all of them. When they choose Lannang, for example, maybe some of them don't choose Tsinoy. Same goes for the other way. Some people choose Tsinoy but don't choose Lannang, but many people choose both as well. Yeah. So I think it's way more complicated. Like, I mean, you don't you can't think of identity as just being monolithic, basically, or just a one-to-one kind of relationship between you and the identity. It's similar to how a lot of Tsinoys, right? Sometimes in very specific situations, they will identify as Filipino, but then they'll kind of like suppress their Chineseness.
Yeah.
But then in other situations, pag nasa China ka, for example, wasi Gongkok lang, I am Chinese in English. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of the Philippine setting, diba, when you talk about the Chinese in the Philippines, malamang sa malamang, marunong mag-Hokkien yung makaka-interact mo. Especially if they're like second generation or like us third generation, fourth generation, right? So, the basic knowledge is that we have that in our systems because our ancestors came from southern China.
Yes.
Right? So is there something deeper to that explains why Hokkien is still prevalent within the local Chinese?
I think it also has to do with the history, because back in the day, right? Like, I think most of the, Lannangs, okay, or Tsinoys, because I think Tsinoy is a very, very broad term, but let me just use the term Lannang because I'm using that term to refer to people who have ancestors who came to the Philippines around the 1900s or 1890 something during the war period when they're trying to escape famine. Yeah. I think that will have an influence, because like if your parents or ancestors are from that generation, then you're more likely to use particular variants of Hokkien as well. So maybe because most of the Hokkien speakers or Lannang speakers tend to have a more Jinkang or Jinjiang accent, which is a kind of specific accent from southern China. And
Jinjiang, right? Yeah. Okay. It's a place in China.
In China.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know that kasi merong associations dito, yung Chenkang Association.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Na nung bata ako, pag may honor ka, may angpao ka at the end of the school year.
You had those?
Oh, meron. See, that's what you get for not being Chinese enough. No angpao.
No angpao.
Sorry, so going back to the Chenkang accent, is that the most common accent in terms of Hokkien dito sa Pinas?
I would say so, but because it's been a very long time since, the 1890s and 1900s, it has already come into contact with other accents like the Quanzhou accent, or I forgot what that is in Hokkien, but the Quanzhou accent and then the Xiamen accent or the Amoy accent. So it's really a mixture of all of those. But I think predominantly, like if you listen to people, when you talk to people, it's still the Jinkang or Jinjiang accent.
So one of the reasons for me why it's been so hard to pick up Hokkien is because walang media to really help me absorb it, right? Like you can't read Hokkien, you can't watch anything in Hokkien unless you actually go out of your way to specifically pursue it, right?
CCTV channel? No.
I don't think so.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of channels, and I actually was curious if there was anything out there. There are some shows, but it's in Minan, so like it's a Taiwanese produced media or mga teleseries nila, and his dad watches like Hokkien material, but like when I sit down, I can pick up some words, but like when you ask me to digest the entire thing, I don't understand.
So what's the difference? Bakit siya iba dun sa Hokkien na that we're familiar with?
Right, because or if you're talking about Taiwanese or Taigi or Taigi as they like to call it, it's because they're basic different variants. Like we tend to think of Hokkien as in the Philippines at least, we tend to think of Hokkien as very monolithic, just one entity. But to be honest, like Hokkien has spread everywhere. Singapore has its own accent of Hokkien as well. Philippines has, Malaysia has Penang Hokkien, for example. And it's just really hard to find that original Hokkien, if it even actually exists, because like the language has really spread. It's like English, right?
Yeah, but like if you speak English in, let's say, the UK versus English in continental Europe or English here in the Philippines, kahit paano magkakaintindihan tayo. But if you try to speak in Philippine Hokkien with someone from Penang, for example, in Malaysia, I don't think they would understand one another. So why is that the case?
If we're talking about Penang and other Southeast Asian diasporic Hokkien speaking communities, because of the regional languages, So in Malaysia, at least, it's English and Malay, right? And in other parts of Southeast Asia, where else, Baba? Singapore, for example. Their Hokkien has a lot of Mandarin influence as well, because like Mandarin is really spoken there.
Yeah.
And
Cantonese din, diba?
English din, yeah. So it's
because
very,
there's no, I think, just to add to what you were saying, like I was thinking there's no centralized like way to, and then I know there are some orgs that are trying to do that now. One of them is like Speak Hokkien org.
Speak Hokkien campaign.
Campaign. That's a really good campaign, but I mean, it's gonna be a long journey.
It is a very long journey.
I mean, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, like was Lannang ever, I don't think it was ever, Hokkien was ever a formal language, right?
It was
it was never formalized.
I think it's safe to say that it's not as formalized as Mandarin.
Yeah.
Because Mandarin is basically what we like to call a standardized language, right? It's very top down. The government actually created it artificially to form for national like ideology. So it's
when you say the government, you're referring to the Chinese government.
Yes, at that time. So it's very similar to Filipino, right? When it was created, it was promoted in 1970s, 1980s. They had to create a grammar, a standardized set of rules to kind of like even out all the variants, basically.
In Hokkien, you're saying na walang rules. But okay, so kung walang rules, kasi nga hindi siya standard, bakit ako kino-correct ng parents ko na, mali yung pagkakasabi mo? Or you're using the wrong words, right?
Yeah.
Walang rules, diba? Sabi mo.
Right. I guess because people tend to have ideologies, basically, their own set of belief systems. And that is very strongly linked to language. Then what you think is usually what you say as well, right? So, for example, if you believe that all languages should be pure, you have a very purist ideology, you will correct people if they mix their language.
Right. So kung kunwari, I want to say, ama, guayat, hyadi. And then nasabi ko siya in a way na parang guayat, hyadi. Like, iba na yung
wrong
meaning.
intonation.
Wrong intonation, right?
Yeah.
So iba na yung kalalabasan niya. Instead of saying, I love you, may masakit or some shit.
I heard you.
All right. Like, I heard you, right? So my mom would my dad would probably call me out na nagkamali ako. So can I just say in response na, actually, you don't get to tell me na I'm wrong kasi wala namang standard rules.
That's kind of like what we're kind of like pushing. Like, I mean, me and a couple of like people at the Lannang Archives were basically trying to kind of like get rid of this very super hyper conservative and very purist way of thinking about language, because the language is basically malleable. It's ours basically, so we can do whatever we want with it, right? So it feels very unfair for people to gatekeep their language if they're already passing on, right?
Oh yeah.
Diba? So parang we have to do something about it, and our ways of preservation may not necessarily be the same way as yours, but it's still our way of like making sure that the language survives somehow. Yeah.
Zooming out here, I want to get into the differences between Philippine Hokkien, or what we're familiar with, regardless of, let's say, you're Manila-based or outside Manila, and I guess Minanhua, which is like the more commonly known na standard, for lack of a better term.
So I think Minan is like a very, very, very broad term.
It's an umbrella.
Right? It's I would say it's an umbrella term actually. So if you say Taiwanese or Taigi, that's technically Minan as well.
Oh, is it? Okay.
It is considered a kind of Minan language.
So mas standard si Taigi.
Southern Min yung tawag in English. It's Southern Min.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a very broad area. So I think Fujianese is also there. Hokkien Ue, basically.
So it's basically like, okay, you have English, but then you have American English,
parang
British
ganon,
English,
very
Welsh.
similar.
Yeah.
So parang the way that we talk about Singlish, for example, is how you would also refer to as Philippine Hokkien, ganon.
I guess you could think about it that way, yes. Because like in Singlish, it's all similar. They also have the very standard version of it, like walang halo. But you can still hear the Singaporean accent in it.
Yeah.
And then they can speak it in a very like unintelligible manner na maraming Malay, Chinese, and all of everything parang tapsay miba or chop suey for people.
But we'll still understand it anyway.
Yes, most likely. I think you just need to be exposed to it a little bit, because sometimes it takes, because I've been in Singapore for like 2 years for my master's, and it took a while to get used to the mixing, but because I know Hokkien and I also know a little bit of Mandarin, it's not as hard, because you can kind of like map you can kind of like trace back. Like, for example, if this person said, is it you think I'm crazy, for example, to mean, because in Mandarin you say 是不是你疯了, or 是不是笑啊, or like that, right? So it's just literally one-to-one correspondence in English. It's easy because I have that knowledge.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you don't have that knowledge, kunwari,
Hello.
someone like me, trying to find the words and then construct the sentence with proper syntax and grammar, sobrang hirap niya.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say so. If you're not really exposed to it, I guess.
We're going to be cutting this episode right here because I know that was a lot to take in. Just talking about Hokkien, its significance culturally and historically. But it's such a fun conversation with our guest, Professor Wilkinson Gonzales, that part 2 should be up on your feeds. If not now, then sometime next week. So that's how we do things here on the podcast. For now, though, we got to get out of here. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Now Steaming. For my co-hosts, Kimberly Mas and Cedric Cheng, my name is Stan C, and this has been another edition of Now Steaming, where we dish out our hot takes as Tsinoy millennials. Now Steaming is hosted by Stan C, Kimberly Mas, and Cedric Cheng. Our show is produced by the Pod Network. Ronel Cheng is our writer and researcher, Zeke Lagran is our editor, and Jasper Manalang is our podcast manager.
The opinions of podcast creators, hosts, and guests are not necessarily reflective of the official stance of the Pod Network Entertainment, its hosts, or other network programs. The content created by the people behind the podcast is personal and not meant to harm any religion, ethnicity, group, organization, company, or individual.